Started. As we wait for others to join, just a reminder to stay muted if you don't mind, and the video off would be helpful as well. And we'll definitely have time for Q&A at the end and want some active participation. And also, we will be recording this tonight. So if everyone's okay with that, but also it will be available for your friends and colleagues to view at a later date. We'll be sure to let you know how that will work. We'll give it just one more minute as we get more people entering. Okay, I think we have people joining, but we'll get started because we have a full night or full hour here. I'm Maura Toole. I'm with the Seneca Lake Pure Waters Association, and we're hosting this event tonight. So I just want to say hello and thank you all for participating in our Lake Friendly Living Awareness Month, which is hosted by the Lake Friendly Living Coalition of the Finger Lakes. The map you see in front of you are all of the participating lakes. Hopefully you're seeing some of your own in there. And as a coalition, we are committed to together working collectively to protect our Finger Lakes. So our 2022 awareness campaign is actually our second year. Last year was only a week, and it was a wonderful week, and we wanted to extend it. So now we have a month-long series of both virtual, as tonight, and also live demonstrations taking place across the Finger Lakes for the next 4 weeks. So we appreciate you being a part of this today. And I think the most important thing to recognize this year, that while we're about being lake friendly, we are also understanding the importance of that in the context of our changing climate. So the topic this year, what the series will address, is what we call lake-friendly living for watershed resiliency. And it's a very important topic when we think about what's happening in our surroundings today with everything you'll actually hear about tonight. So with that, I definitely we're so honored and pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Fred Stoss, who's with the University of Buffalo. Fred is a dedicated, and I have to make sure I clearly articulate this because it's been really wonderful working with him the last month. He's a dedicated environmental researcher and advocate. He holds degrees in biology, zoology, and library science, and has dedicated his professional life to sustainability research and environmental advocacy. He's more than 100 articles and professional presentations in the areas of both environmental science and library science. He's been cited as a climate leader in the United States by the Climate Reality Project, which is dedicated to unleashing a global cultural movement demanding action on the climate crisis. So we welcome Fred. We certainly appreciate him being our keynote speaker for our Lake Friendly Awareness series. I'm going to turn it over to him, but I also just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. You all are muted and silent, or in video off as well. We will give you time to do Q&A at the end. So we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, but in the Q&A area. And Fred will definitely be addressing those. And if there are some topics that you want to put in there for discussion later, those can go into chat. So questions in one, and then maybe other comments in the chat. And I think with that, I am going to very happily turn it over to Fred. I think this will be very interesting. Again, Fred, we appreciate you being part of our whole effort to bring lake-friendly living into the context of climate resiliency. So with that, thank you, Fred.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk on a topic that is very dear to my heart for a large number of reasons. We're going to do a little bit of looking at some of the things that we know about climate change, some of the policies that are driving this, and towards the end, we're going to take a look at what people can do individually as well as collectively, and perhaps tying that into what we might want to look at as a more systems view of dealing with climate change. I was trained by Al Gore 15 and a half years ago when I went down to Nashville, Tennessee, with the Climate Project at the time, which was a nonprofit organization. And we were gathered there among the first 1,000 climate messengers that Al Gore wanted to train to go out and present the slideshow at that time, which was the slideshow seen on the documentary film An Inconvenient Truth. And most of us start our presentations with this particular picture of Earthrise. It was the first picture taken with another planet of Earth, with another planetary body in the foreground, and represented sort of like an iconic image of the Earth, and put it into a perspective where some people were saying about how small it is, and that everything that's happening on Earth is happening on that little globe that's in front of us. How I got into this, as I said, I was one of the first 1,000 climate messengers. I think I was among the first 250. And I've mentored for the Climate Reality Project 5 times. And I think that we all know who Al Gore is. Like a little background about me. I got my work in research was in the field of toxicology at the University of Rochester Medical Center, and eventually at the Syracuse Research Corporation, where I got interested in the data and information side of the environment, and ended up with a library science degree by pure accident. So I'm the accidental librarian, if you ever want to know of one. what I'm showing here is a paper, two papers that I had written on the world data centers, where much of the physical data that Al Gore uses in his presentations, the real science of things, is archived in the world data centers that were created with the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. As a librarian, I have to show you some grants about the growth of scientific and technical information in the Web of Science database from 1990 to 2021. Almost 500,000 journal articles that are essentially the essence of the science and technology of scholarly and academic literature. If we take a look at another database, and we take a look at magazine content, magazine and general interest and popular magazine articles, and where the public at large gets most of their information from any particular topic. But this shows from 1980 to 2021 the occurrence of climate change in that body of literature. And you can see that there are these little humps and that are over there before the year 2000 that more or less coincide with presidential elections, when it looks as though that there's going to be some traction. And all of a sudden around 2005, 2006, there's this big, huge spike. And we're going to take a look at why did we get that spike? And there's two different scales here, but we see when Al Gore releases An Inconvenient Truth, there's this big, huge spike that pushes everything up. That with the awareness factor of what was going on was definitely obvious there. We see over a 2-year period of time, and it was late in 2000. It was released in 2006, late 2007. He receives a Nobel Prize for the Peace Prize, as well as 2 Oscars for the movie. And then I look at this sort of like that top hat kind of, or that witch's hat, if you drew a straight line across, sort of like looking at the celebrity period of time. But then we see it starts evening out, and we get these peaks. One of them occurs about the time that the Paris Accord is done. There was a lot of literature that was being published for the general public's consumption about the Paris Accord. And then the new kid on the block, Greta Thunberg, comes along, and we see another big spike in the publication of information on climate change, spurred on by her environmental activism that resulted from her sit-down strike and subsequent fame as an environmental advocate, and helping to spark the climate youth movement. So how did we get, and why did we get to where we are today? Well, we see daily evidence that we're living in a greenhouse gas constrained world, and we're going to see some facts about why that is true. We're increasing our linkages and causes that the humans are causing some of these natural cycles to be disrupted at unprecedented rates. The causes and the effects are known, and there remains hope, because we know that we do have solutions, and there's still time to act, but we're fast running out of time. And I think that if you listen to any of the scientists who are saying that, who for 30 or more years have been saying time is running out, and it still is, but with a lot more urgency today. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but this is a graph that shows essentially how the greenhouse effect works. That the sun's rays come and warm the surface area and the oceans of the Earth. Some of that radiation goes back out into the atmosphere and goes back out into space. Some of it is captured in our atmosphere. I've got a listing of other greenhouse gases that are involved. We're not going to go over each one of those, but on the right-hand side of that blue curve, what we do is when we add those greenhouse gases, we're essentially thickening the blanket of materials in the atmosphere that are heat trapping and provide more warming to the Earth. So there's that warming trend that we see, and we're going to explore a little bit later. This particular graph right here is probably the most well-known of any of the climate information. It's known as the Keeling curve. It was started by Charles David Keeling in 1957, 1958 as part of the International Geophysical Year. And it was the beginning of collecting atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide in real time. And today there are scores of sites around the world that are doing this, and they're taking measurements once every 15 minutes that a sample is taken and analyzed. And we see a characteristic sawtooth kind of a fashion here, where at the top, the peaks, is when the vegetation is breathing out carbon dioxide because it's during their during the winter, late fall, winter, early spring season. And we are right now about where that line is, about halfway through, that as the plants begin and vegetation begins to grow, photosynthesis takes place, it's going to breathe in CO2 as it uptakes the CO2 into the vegetation. So we get lower numbers that are there. But the curve here that shows the Keeling curve does show this quite nicely from 1960 to about the present. Well, I've got some graphs around here that show some things from when we start linking at where do some of the emissions, that was atmospheric concentration, but where are the emissions? What are the sources of carbon dioxide by country? And you can see that over the course of the past 40, 50 years, that China is increasing dramatically. And yes, the United States has leveled off. And part of the reason why the European Union is actually declining, and we see Russia is declining in some of these, it's because we have shifted so much of our manufacturing capacity to China. And if you do carbon outsourcing, is what it's called, you'll see if we claimed the emissions for the products that we import from China, there's a huge arrow that comes back to the United States because China is doing the emitting, we're doing the buying. This is another iconic kind of a graph that we've seen of glaciers from the Antarctic that have shown over 800,000 year period of time that takes a look at carbon dioxide levels and during the glacial and interglacial periods, so that we're seeing glaciers taking during those troughs, and those peaks are when we're coming out of a glaciation period. But we take a look here that when we see this, that the highest peak ever obtained in any of these ice cores is about 300 parts per million. And the graphs that I've shown here that of April, just a few weeks ago, the number was 420, almost 421 parts per million, that we have dramatically increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, when we look at this, how did we ever know what all those carbon dioxide levels were back 800,000 years ago? Well, they capture that data in ice cores where there are microscopic air bubbles that were captured and frozen into the ice. And they go back, take the ice cores, section them, put them into a vacuum sealed device, and just melt them. And what was in those air bubbles is released, and they measure them. And that's called proxy data. And it just means it's data that was collected. It's a physical nature that represents a characteristic of the environment. It's not a direct measurement. And probably one of the other ones that's most popular known are tree rings, but they also look at various fossil pollen records, ocean sediments, coral, historical data. The one I show here is the grape harvest dates that reconstruct the summer temperatures in Paris from the late 1300s to the 1880s, and they meticulously characterize this data so that we get an idea that the data can actually be used to say this is what the temperature was based on the way that the harvest data was collected, when the grapes ripened, how many ripened, what was the extent, when did the ripening season start and stop? So all that data gives a really close approximation. When I was working at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, we were doing some work with Chinese plum rains where they were about over 1,000 years of data on plum trees and when they bloomed and how it's going on. That's opposed to the real-time data collection where there's instrumentation, they collect the data, it's laboratory and field studies, and it links all sorts of things that we can do with their real measurements that are taking place. One of the most popular ones that we see is when you look at your weather forecast tonight and you see the data on the weather maps collected by NOAA all of that data will eventually end up being archived and put into climate models. Another familiar pattern is for the annual fossil fuel emissions by the number of billion of metric tons. And there's another graph here that shows from around 1900, we can see this fossil fuel emission greatly increasing, especially and after World War II, and you think about the industrialization worldwide that took place after World War II, peaks and troughs that represent various things. And this got the Global Carbon Project put a couple of them in those little blue bands. But one of the interesting things is you can see the impact that COVID had COVID-19 had in 2020 with a pretty dramatic decrease in the fossil fuel emissions because we just weren't using as much energy transportation-wise, manufacturing-wise, and the such. So you can put together a little scenario that says, well, if you don't put as much fossil fuel into the waste products into the air, the emissions go down. Where do we get this data? And this is what we know with great certainty. And I just threw up two of them here. One is the U.S. National Assessment. The next issue is coming out next year. It's currently being written. It'll probably come out in 2, maybe 3 volumes this time. And the International Panel for Climate Change is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, writes their global assessments. This is the one for 2021. You probably may have heard, read, or seen the climate change that they really ramped up. The fact is that we are really running out of time, and the seriousness with which things are taking place. Well, what do we know? The data is compelling. We know the global temperature is rising from anywhere from 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is approximately 1 degree centigrade. And the source of this is from NASA. But I got some graphs here that I just want to quickly go through to show what the extent of that temperature is on a grand scale. This is one that shows the temperature, the annual averages, and those are the blue dots, and you see those spikes that go up and down. Some of them actually correspond to El Nino and La Nina events. The quintillion averages, it's a statistical technique where they take 5 years, average it, put the point on the graph, take the next 5 years, and they just smooth the curve out to give you an idea of how to smooth the data, and it gives a better overall representation. But on this particular graph, it shows also the CO2 from the combustion of fossil fuels in that yellow line, and the concentrations in the atmosphere. And from about 1960 to the present, we see a pretty close correlation to what's going on. And there's different scales that are written on this, and but we know that this is one of the things that we do know. Here again is taking a look at what is known as the hockey stick, for which Michael Mann was questioned and challenged by a variety of people for the accuracy of the data. Has been vindicated by several major studies that said he actually underestimated his original I think it was 1995 hockey stick. But we show different things in here about all of the data up till the present, to the modern warming discovered, where we actually had thermometers, we had instrumentation that could measure it. But all of this data in the from 100 to about 1757 or 1800s, early 1900s, was collected from Proxy Data, and then we begin the modern record, or the instrumentation. Just some things in here in terms of some volcanoes. And what happens when we see the volcanoes, we see sometimes a cooling of the earth because of the amount of aerosols, particulates, soot, dust, and the such that go into the atmosphere. There's an overall cooling effect, and NASA scientist Jim Hansen had referred to this, and also including air pollutants in that mix in the more modern area, as known as dimming the sun. This is perhaps one of the most important series of slides that Mr. Gore presents, and it's taking a look at the data that was collected for this particular bell-shaped curve. They scattered it around, and this is what the bell-shaped distribution looked like for cold, average, and warm at temperatures globally. So when we do that, we see that we have this baseline, and we can see that things are warmer than average, or cooler than average. Well, compared to that 1951 to 1980, when we see what happens in the next decade, we see a shifting of that to the right, and we've actually added a new category of extremely hot to the right of that graph. It's sort of like in a burgundy kind of a color. We're going to see that for the 1980s. We go from 1994 to 2004, and we see that it's larger. We still have cold days and cold weather. We have mild weather, average weather, and we have warm weather, but we see a lot more weather that's of extremely hot. And then we go up to 2015. And we see now that the extreme temperature events used to cover 0.1% of the Earth. Now they cover 14.5% and getting larger every year. There may be some temperature changes that we're going to be looking at in the future that are going to push that curve way, way to the right. Well, what happens in New York? This is from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a really big high-level science and technology federal agency that collects data. They're the ones, people who rely on NOAA data are the ones who rely on those weather maps that we see. So we know that there's the data has some bona fides. So this is what it looks like for New York. And we see a gradual increase from 1900. Yeah, there are periods of up and down in the and we see, but if you did the smoothing average, you would see that the trend is going upwards. When we take a look at some other kinds of proxy data, we know that lake and freezing data for lakes, and there are 3 lakes in this study that was done. Lake George, Mirror up in the eastern part of the state, Mirror Lake in the central, north central Adirondack High Peaks region, and Otsego Lake just around Cooperstown. And you can see that the lakes are generally freezing later and thawing earlier. Well, what happens about severe drought in New York State? We see that, yeah, we've had damages in 2016. Most recently was the most recent that we had, where there were damaged crops, especially over in those red areas. Most of it was related to corn. The DEC temporarily closed fishing on the Salmon River during the peak time when the salmon should have been running, and it was just essential to protect the fish from being caught and physiologically stressed due to the fact that the oxygen content of the water was decreased because of the warmer waters. Now, in April and through in July, in April of 2016, there's on the top is Montour Falls in April. In July, this is what it looked like, and I remember my late wife and we took a trip on our anniversary to go down to the Finger Lakes, and there was hardly any water by August, on August 24th. But 2 years later, this is that same waterfalls when there was that catastrophic rainout that happened that followed right down the south on the east side of Seneca Lake. What we do know with great certainty is that the oceans are warming, that the top 100 meters have increased by about a little more than 0.5 degree centigrade, which is an enormous amount of heat when you're considering the volume of water that's being heated. We see shrinking ice sheets. We have several researchers here at the University at Buffalo that are studying with their graduate students, their doctoral and master's students in Greenland. But it says here that Greenland has lost almost 280 billion tons of ice from 1993 to 1999. And the Antarctic lost 148 billion tons of ice per year. That's an incredible amount of water that we'll see another slide that will lead us to what are the consequences of a lot of land ice. When the ice is on the land, goes into the ocean, it'll actually cause sea level increase. But here's some reasons why. We see some right here, these temperature profiles of look what was happening to Greenland, to its ice sheet in April, and you can see other portions of the world that were under this heat wave, except for the west central, or the west, sort of like the west central part of Canada that was under sort of like a temperature anomaly that we had there, but they drift around quite a bit. We know that glaciers are retreating. Mr. Gore has probably several score of pictures of showing a picture of a glacier at one point in time, and then taking a look at the same glacier a couple of years or decades later, and showing the loss of land ice, where the ice is just melting and running off. What we do know is that there's a decrease in the northern hemisphere, a decreased snow cover in the past 5 decades. we have heard and seen so much tragedy about the impact of drought and subsequent wildfires. Last, in 2 years, Lake Mead, this is the more dramatic picture, but if you can imagine that, almost twice is that landmass it's showing where the reservoir is being almost twice as much being exposed right now because there has not been such a low amount of snow melt and rain. And then we all have heard and read about the wildfires out in the west, most predominantly in California and Paradise, California, that in 2020 the entire city was taken by a wildfire. We've had a new phrase that's been added into our climate lexicon, atmospheric rivers, and shown here is this big low pressure system that is just picking up an incredible amount of water off of the Pacific Ocean and dumps it into the Pacific Northwest and to the southwest portion of Canada. We see a tremendous flooding that can result from that. I think last year there was one that actually Vancouver was actually separated because all of the bridges were washed out. It was separated from the land mass of Canada proper. So we see these atmospheric rivers. I guess you would say the best analogy is when they get a lake effect storm, the Pacific Ocean is their lake. Now the jet stream has become erratic as the polar vortex becomes more disrupted. I'll have a little bit more to say about and show about the polar vortex, but this is sort of like what the normal jet stream looks like. And you can see Greenland is almost in the center there, and it's this configuration of a smooth moving, sort of like a circular thing that tends to keep the cold weather north and up into the northern regions around the North Pole. But what we're seeing today is that the jet stream has become much more erratic in its nature, where it's starting to form different kind of patterns. It's being broken up, and some people think that this may actually be a permanent kind of a situation where we're going to be seeing extreme cold waves descending deep into the United States, as they did last year in Texas, when the cold weather froze up so much of its, literally froze up so much of its electrical grid. And if it wasn't for the solar heat that was being, the solar power that was being generated, could have caused an almost near collapse of the grid and the electricity. And just 2 years later, the polar vortex actually split into 3 different parts. So we know that this is becoming very, very disruptive. What we know with great certainty is as more and more ice is melting, as more and more rain is falling and more glaciers are melting, global sea level is raising about 8 inches in the last century. Here's Fort Lauderdale during king tide time. We know that there are record high temperature events are increasing since the 1950s. Here we see in the darker red color is a smooth curve for daily high, the number of daily high events, and the daily lows are hot. The daily hot low temperatures are also increasing. So we know that the low high temperatures and the high temperatures are increasing, and the converse is happening with cold days and colder cold days. We see them decreasing from about the same period of time. We still have them. As a matter of fact, we experienced some of them this year. We do know that the ocean is acidifying, and here we show a graph that shows the Mauna Loa atmospheric Keeling curve. That's the red line. We show what happens when the atmosphere interacts with the water through wave interactions and the such, that the air becomes more and more saturated with carbon dioxide. That's the blue, and as a result, the oceans become more acidic, which is in green. And this has been a phenomenon that was only been recently discovered and has had ramifications for disruption of marine life across the board. So this is what we just saw. The source of this is NASA's Global Change, Vital Signs of the Planet. I put the link in here, and I'm going to make this slideshow available to people in a PDF format, so the Alliance can have it, and you can just chime on. The links are not going to be hot links, but you'll at least be able to write them down, or I think you might be able to copy them. So this is probably one of the most dramatic.
This is what would happen to Manhattan.
from the inconvenient truth.
They can measure this precisely, just as the scientists could predict precisely how much water would breach the levees in New Orleans. The area where the World Trade Center Memorial is to be located would be underwater.
The Hudson River, downtown Manhattan, was literally pouring into the ground zero site.
That particular film clip was what happened when Hurricane Sandy ravaged the shoreline areas of New Jersey, New York, and portions of Connecticut. It gave a dramatic representation of what would happen as a result of some of these events. And what happened with Hurricane Sandy was it intensified, and it was a huge, huge storm that had a significant storm surge. It was not a very strong hurricane, but it was just a really, really big one. And we can take a look here and seeing that over the course of time from 1980 to the present, that the number of extreme events worldwide has increased proportionately, and you can see the different types that have taken place here. Now, local impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the Climate Solutions Accelerator. And this is from their website, because they give some very detailed synopses of what's going on with what they have identified as major climate impacts regionally in the Finger Lakes Genesee Basin. A lot of this stuff is data that's been collected and stored and archived at Cornell University from a number of wide variety of places. So if you want to jot any one URL down right now, is www.climategfl.org. And I'm going to give some more comments on this, but this particular page, go to this page. They've got an incredible website. Go to this page if you want to see the severity of what happened with some of these events. Additional state impacts you can get from the DEC from this site is the impacts of climate change in New York. I'm talking from warmer temperatures, rain and snow, precipitation, sea level, natural resources, health risks. We know that one of the health risks is Lyme disease is spreading, and we know that there could be they're still investigating the link between that and chronic wasting disease in our local and regional deer herds and the such. So we know that there are impacts that are happening to the ecology of New York that are causing things to change. Another one, sort of anecdotal because I haven't seen any real hard data, but snowshoe hares that make their transition from looking at their beautiful brownish blending into the surroundings coat, they turn snow white in the wintertime to blend in with the beautiful surroundings of the winter. Well, as winters become delayed and the snow is delayed, the snowshoe hares are turning white while there is still the natural brownish kind of color, and it's the predation can increase. So New York State, the number of downpours between 1950 and 1916, more heavy rain. That comes from the downpour index for New York. It's done, the link is here from Climate Central. It's getting wetter. This was a graph that was done again from NOAA, from the National Center for Environmental Information, Climate at a Glance, which is their site. We're going to look at that a little later. But we're seeing that New York is in one of the areas, New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire are areas where we have seen increased rainfall since the 1950s. So what are some of the things that we can actually see? We hear about all sorts of devastations that happen when these big floods and when rivers flood around the world, or catastrophic and cataclysmic events, but we have evidence that it's happening here in New York with what we had a couple of years where there was some heavy snow melt with some unseasonable rain that caused all sorts of damage on Lake Ontario. We saw that in September of 2011, I think there was Hurricane Irene, the Susquehanna River in Vestal, New York. I graduated from Vestal High School, and where I grew up, well, I sort of grew up in Johnstown, but my father ripped us from our ancestral roots from Johnstown to go to Vestal. But my parents' house is about 3/4 of a mile to the right, up the hill, fortunately up the hill. So we see that there was the Great Halloween Flood of 2017, where it ravaged the south central to the east central. The lower portion of the Adirondacks had about 9 to 10 inches of rain that fell in a very short period of time. As of last summer, there were still 6 interior highways or roads that had not yet been replaced. Now, in the Finger Lakes, we've seen some things that have taken place with mostly flash flood events. So we saw here that a lot of this stuff has been archived and photos in the Finger Lakes Daily News. But we're seeing that more and more maps, like the one shown here in the bottom right, we're seeing more maps like this that are showing these big rainstorms, single events. They're episodic, serious events that take place that dump an incredible amount of rain in a very short period of time that cause all sorts of problems with flash floods. And most of you, if you are either living permanently or if you have summer cottages down in the Finger Lakes, have probably had some of the effects of taking place to infrastructure, to seeing streams that have flooded, and shorelines. I think it was Seneca Lake has had a number of times where they've had boat advisories because of all the debris that flows into the lakes. Now, I work at the University at Buffalo. Remember, we have these lake effect storms that come in every once in a while. And that's all I'm going to say. And I want to say there's one picture in here that shows it all. It's the one on the right. We are resilient here in Buffalo. But when we see a lake effect storm taking place here in Buffalo, we have our moments. Niagara Falls froze. This is where the polar vortex was sort of like officially added to our environmental or climate lexicon in 2013, when Rush Limbaugh said, "Oh, the polar vortex is nothing more than a made-up word." And Al Roker, a weather forecaster, a graduate from SUNY Oswego, refutes the Limbaugh claim with a reference from a 1959 meteorological reference book that defined the polar vortex. Some of the things that have taken place. I love to fly fish. I've been fly fishing for a long time. Awatka and Spring Creeks that are south and a little bit west of Rochester in the northern part of Livingston County. We had a couple of years I think it was 2014 and 2015, where extreme cold, where most of the surface water in the region froze over. Up to 75% of Lake Ontario was frozen. Awatka Creek in places and Spring Creek for almost its entire run were completely ice-free because their temperature profiles remain relatively constant and they don't freeze. Well, mergansers that are fish-eating ducks, and they like to eat trout, said here that 85% of their diet. Those waters lost upwards to 99% mortality cited by anglers, and eventually I have to take into consideration that sport fishing in New York is almost a $3 billion a year industry. But the DEC went in and did a 15-month study that said, yes, the number of adult catchable fish in these creeks declined significantly. Temperature trends in Rochester. This was taken again from NOAA data that was aggregated by Climate Central to show by decade what's happened to the temperature profile from 1900 to 2020. It's getting warmer. Now, what is New York State going to do about all of this? Well, back in 2018, it was proposed for having some legislation that was going to actually have some teeth in it and actually do something to solve the climate crisis. And on July 18th, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, known sometimes as the Climate Act. It's one of the most ambitious climate laws in the world. It's going to put New York on a path for carbon neutrality, and it's going to greatly reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by 40% in just a few years, no less than 85% in 2050. I hope that I'm around for my 100th birthday and can see that number in reality. It was created, the Climate Leadership Act, the Climate Act created the Climate Action Council that last December released a draft scoping plan for how are we going to get this done. And the background and details are at climate.newyork.gov. And I put in here, think community action. Every single one of you that are associated with a lake association should be making your own public comments on that. You've got until June 10th to gather your strength and your numbers and make a cogent written testimony to say what your concerns are and how you think that your community not only can benefit, but can contribute to promoting and seeing that the Climate Protection Act, the Leadership and Community Protection Act, will function properly and benefit all of New York State and probably some of the surrounding areas. What is it going to do? It's going to eliminate almost a lot of carbon emissions from the electricity sector. It's going to change almost all cars and vehicles are going to have to be eventually electric vehicles, which is a trend that is happening worldwide. It's going to significantly reduce the number of vehicle miles that are going to be traveled. And I will admit, my carbon sin, mea culpa, my carbon sin, I live 65 miles from where I work. And yes, I pay fees to go back to recapturing some of that through buyback with for seeing that trees are planted because of my carbon sin. We're going to change heating systems and cooling systems in a lot of buildings to eliminate electricity-based or fossil fuel-based heating systems and significantly reduce the amount of fossil fuels in manufacturing, which is already starting to take place in small sector places around the country. The Climate Community Protection Act, a big win for New York State on jobs and the economy, was written by Robert Poulin out of the University of Massachusetts and is going to be creating a lot of jobs in New York State. A lot of jobs are going to generate a lot of income tax. It's going to have spill over that those 160,000 jobs are going to have peripheral jobs added to it to support those workers and support in about 150,000 jobs on the average in each year over the first decade. That including induced jobs created by increased purchasing power of clean energy workers. That goes back to that fact is that those 160,000 workers are going to have disposable income that is going to be used for purchasing other materials, real estate, and other material goods. It's going to create and support 220,000 jobs over the first decade. The majority, 55%, of the clean energy sectors are going to be held with people without a college degree, and they're going to probably be making about $60,000 a year. But for workers with a college degree or an associate's degree, the average compensation is expected to be over $70,000 per year. And at the bottom, the report, the Poulin's report, said that the green economy, and I sometimes take umbrage to the use of green energy or green economy and thinking that I can turn off a lot of people if I want to talk about the green economy or the green energy. I like to talk about smart economy transition and smart energy technologies. But green economy, it comes out in the wash. Required under, oh, there's a typo, it should be CLPA. Is expected to generate about $138 billion in revenues for New York State. Well, who's getting funded to do some of this climate activism kind of work? The Timbuktu Summer Climate Career Institute up in the Adirondacks has reported that they have a $2.1 million partnership with SUNY ESF and the city of New York and the Adirondack Council and other Adirondack Park advocates are going to be funding this particular thing for a series of educational venues that are going to be taking place up in the Adirondacks. NOAA, the national has an environmental literacy program nationwide for essentially people in the K through 12 formal education, but also a lot of things that are going to be going into the non-formal education side of museums, nature center, other programs that are going to be geared towards citizen science opportunities, civic engagement, and other professional development in both the formal and non-formal sector, such as the non-formal sector, such as those represented by the New York State Outdoor Education Association, who I think 3 out of the last 4 or 4 out of the last 5 years has had climate change as a major theme in its annual programming. Now, this was supposed to be something that we were going to be acting on last year, but it's been postponed until November of this year. And again, another opportunity for individuals and for communities, the collective, as more and more individuals start working together. The Environmental Bond Act, it was raised from $3 billion to $4.2 billion for New York State. In 21, the legislature voted to put it on the ballot this November. Hundreds of, if not thousands of other jobs associated with, some of them may overlap with the Climate Leadership and Protection, Community Protection Act, but we're seeing incredible amounts of money coming into New York State that involve individuals making their elected officials knowing that this is taking place and they should be supporting it. And then gathering and collectively within various types of districts or regional compacts and councils for seeing that your voices are being heard. So how does this work? Well, from an individual perspective, you can hook up with NYSERDA to finding out how to get involved with some of their clean energy communities. And you like to talk about smart energy, to apply for grants. These are individual grants. And I would like to see a day when some contractor who's going to be building a new housing development or something comes up with a grant that says we're going to be taking a very comprehensive look at including geothermal, solar, and maybe even wind turbine in that particular community. We can go and take a look at solar installations, and there's a whole series of websites that are out there for New York Community Solar is one of them, for where you can go to get individual assistance in putting solar energy on your own property or properties. Another place to go is the Foundation Directory for funding. It is the quintessential go-to place. Just go to your public library and ask a librarian for help on using their online portal for being able to find out what kind of community grants or school grants or nature center grants that are available to for looking at this. So what can you do? The Climate Reality Project's got a couple of things that they tell you what to do. Is one, to speak up, win the conversation, and don't let climate denial go unchallenged. Use the social and traditional media to get the word out. Write letters to the editor. Call your TV and radio stations. Write online media and bloggers, and any place where you think that your voice can and should or must be heard, is to get out and win the conversation. You can deepen your commitment. Make consumer choices that reduce energy use on an individual basis, and consider the impact of items that you buy. But you really have to start thinking bigger. And because we have delayed doing the upper two for so long, we really need to start thinking bigger, faster. And individual actions are great, but we need to think about large-scale projects and technologies that support them. Well, how large is large? Well, here's a vacant space that was over by the off of Lyle Otis near Edison High School. There's Edison's High School's track. That's a solar array. Here's another 7,800 panels that are the largest brownfield project, also located in the city. Some of these projects have been delayed, some other projects have been delayed because of what's happened with COVID. But Mega Sun is a project for a gigantic solar farms proposed in the Rochester region. They call them 3 behemoths, covering more than 1,000 acres. Some of them are going to be built in Caledonia, Mount Morris, and Byron. And on a sunny afternoon, it turns out that some of these plants are going to have, these 3 plants may have the capacity to electrify what was done by the Gunay nuclear power plant just north and east of Rochester. The biggest of one of them is going to be in the Genesee town of Byron, covered 2,000 acres, 10 times the size of an average New York farm. What's 2,000 acres? Picture every square foot of East Rochester covered with 12-foot high solar panels, and then add in the village of Fairport too. It's a lot of area for a lot of electricity. Don't give up. The new smart energy technologies is more important than changing light bulbs. Think systems. Changing laws is even more important than changing light bulbs. The climate our Climate Act from New York is the best example I can give. Tell your leaders that this matters to you, regardless of what their political beliefs are. Let them know that you support and strongly support their or oppose their efforts, and tell them why. You do this by coming educated. Contact your elected officials and their staffs. How to do that? Again, go to your public library. They can pull that information up with about 2 or 3 clicks of a mouse. And they can give you all the addresses that you need. Put them on your websites if you're doing for a regional group. Put the list of the elected officials from your towns, your village town supervisors to your county executives and all the way up. What you can do, this is me. This is my thing. Learn, read, listen, and be informed. I just put up several what I think are some really good books to look at, especially Drawdown and their online source that Paul Hawking did. And I know there are a couple of people who have been using Drawdown as for reading clubs and the such. The Rochester Area Pachamama Alliance used Drawdown. I think they're coming back with some new 4-week seminars once a week for an hour and a half. Regeneration is sort of like is picking up where Drawdown left off. Catherine Hayhoe, climate change director for Texas Tech, degrees in atmospheric physics and climatology, featured by Forbes and Time Magazine as one of the most influential people in the world. She's a devout evangelical Christian. Bob Henson, who is a member of the American Meteorological Society, has wrote this book that at one time, the first edition, won an award by the Atmospheric Science Librarians International as Best of Show, as did Saving Us, Catherine Hayhoe, this year. A book that just came out a few weeks ago is Climate Change for Dummies. So the one site that I want to talk about is the Climate Solutions Accelerator. I don't think that you're going to find another local, regional, or statewide nonprofit organization that is addressing climate change as robustly and as meaningful as the accelerator is doing. Their fingers are on so many pulses of the climate change saga and bring, I would call, new lifeblood to the table. They're providing resources, services, and actions galore. My disclaimer that I put up here, here's their homepage. It's an inclusive, nonpartisan 501c3 dedicated to inspiring and facilitating a large-scale climate mobilization in the 9-county Genesee Finger Lakes region. The disclaimer is, I'm a sustaining member and have been for, I think, a little bit more than a year. I just believe so much of what they're doing and feel that I have an obligation to support the goodness of what they're doing. Some other places to get national data: the National Centers for Environmental Information, free graphs, pictures, all sorts of data. Some of it actually parsed out for lay audiences. No, this is the some of the just for Cayuga Lake alone, which you can get from them, the climate reports, the national climate reports from NCEI. So we can go through and find out all sorts of data that we get. NASA has the Global Change Master Directory if you're looking for more intensive research kind of data. And these are essentially metadata, which is data about data. It's got about 35,000 data records, most in the United States, but worldwide. We have Earth data that comes from NASA, and you've got some sites down here looking. They actually have sites for the Finger Lakes for Earth data down there, showing satellite images that we get from the Finger Lakes region. The Summer Institute for Climate Education is going to be taking place the 18th and 19th of this year. It's sponsored by the Climate Generation and NOAA. This is a site that you want to log on to see if you are an educator or if you have the desire to educate people on climate change. By all means, chime in and take a look at what they're doing. The Climate Reality Project has closed the registration for its work. They have a workshop that's going to be taking place in June in Las Vegas. So as I end, we're going to end where we started on this little planet that we see here. And that's my daughter on the Mesenthal Glacier over in Alaska. She's now an environmental educator at RIT. That's my grandson and my granddaughter, Eric and Jojo. So I'm doing it for them. And the simple truth is that it's reality. Why? There's no planet B. And I am done.
Thank you, Fred. Wow. A lot there. I think also very nice that we will have this available. I can just see people wanting maybe to go back and look at some of the resources. I know Caitlin put some of the URLs in the website or in the chat box as well. So right now, we have a few minutes, and if there are people who would like to ask Fred some questions, you can easily put them in the Q&A and Fred can answer them. While you're thinking of questions, all of our webinars for the Lake Friendly Living Awareness Month will be posted on our Lake Friendly Living Coalition website, which is where you registered. We can put that in the chat, but that will be www.flrwa.org. That's Finger Lakes Regional Watershed Alliance.org. And then /lake-friendly-living. And you will see, you'll see last year's webinars, and we'll get this up and posted as soon as possible. So you can definitely use it. But so many resources. Any questions out there for Fred while we have him here with us?
More, it actually looks like the Q&A chat box isn't enabled.
Oh, okay.
And I would suggest people just use the chat box that we're all familiar with to ask questions.
Thank you for letting us know. Apologies for that. Fred also has his contact information in the chat box if anyone would like to reach out to him. Thank you, Fred, for making that available.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Okay, here I am. Now I'm back live.
There you go.
So if there are people who want to stay, I'll stay until 8:30 if we want to engage in a conversation or talk about some specific aspect of what's going on. It's hard to shut me up. So
I do have one question here that came up. When we have flash floods like last August, and many of them, has anyone studied the water for what's washed in? For what's washed in? Meaning what gets washed from the runoff?
In terms of pollutant loads, I haven't seen any data, but I can tell you that there might be some local citizen science projects that are taking place, and one of the better ones, the Canisius Lake Association has been monitoring lake water quality for quite some time. And I think that when you go through and take a look at the data that they have, and I'm not sure if that data is available on their website, but I know that I think a person who, I'm not sure if you've been in contact with Chris Willoughby.
Yes. So
Chris,
yeah.
Chris is a past president of the association, and Chris and my paths crossed several ways. He and my wife went to high school together, and I met Chris when he was working as a chemical aquatic chemist technician at Brockport when I was getting one of my graduate degrees in zoology, and was an aquatic science ecotoxicology program at Brockport.
Yeah, I think your point on Canisius, but I think also I would think all of the lake associations, that's largely part of their individual missions as well as collective, look at those data points and the monitoring and actually get involved in, potentially improving some of these issues with runoff and the sediment and then obviously the pollution that runs into the lake. So I would encourage everyone to go to your local lake association and see the programs that are available, and ideally ways maybe you can get involved in it as well. Yeah, most of these associations really work on the concept of citizen scientists. So we rely heavily on volunteers to help us, accomplish the things that we do to both understand the problems and then certainly do something to correct them.
Yeah, I know we have a researcher in our geology department here at UB, Chris Lowry, who has been doing a lot of citizen science work, initially starting about taking a look at stream data related to fracking in the Marcellus shales. And just to give you an idea that back, for those of us that are old enough to remember the old acid rain days, Paul Godfrey, who was the director of the Water Research Institute for the state of Massachusetts at UMass and Amherst, he actually had a couple of research grants that were heavily involved with citizen science in acid rain stream and lake monitoring that had tremendously high correlations with the actual real data that was being collected by EPA and state agencies. And we know that citizen scientists can be incredibly dedicated, making sure that they cross every T and dot every I for the accuracy of their data. So if anybody's interested in that, they can either contact me or I can put you in contact with some other people that are doing, but you might want to take a look at your lake associations. And it wouldn't be a bad idea if somebody actually had a page that linked there, if they are doing studies, regardless of what they are, putting them up on one page so people don't have to go scrounging around looking for them. The Finger Lakes Institute is another place that spearheads some of that information, and it's been a while since they've had an annual meeting. They used to have a one-day meeting usually around April, May, but they haven't, primarily because everything is delayed academically because of COVID.
So we do have a few more questions coming in. So here, will the CLCPA have an enforcement function or agency?
Right now, there's not an enforcement function, and they're just still trying to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to go about doing it. I don't think that there's going to be an effort that's going to be wanting to look at making things punitive in nature, because that tends to sometimes discourage people. But I would take a look at the one link that I provided for that. For them, there's an awful lot of information about the act that is there. They're right now in the process, and they are really seeking citizen input for how they're going to do all their different panels, their public comments. I'm on. We got a couple of us from here out at UB that are on one of the plant panels. I'm doing the one that has on environmental and climate justice issues.
Okay. So, and also just an acknowledgement along, you mentioned the Finger Lakes Institute. Also, we know the Community Science Institute down around Cayuga Lakes, another very involved
That's right.
group as well. So here's a question. Are local governments adjusting and planning for climate change effects, including flash flooding?
Many of them have had climate-related program offices for the better portion of 10, maybe up to 15 years or so. And that like, I know the city of Rochester has a climate program, as does Monroe County. So you can just check your local government structure and finding out what they're doing. And these are the people with whom citizens, when I talked about individuals and the collective, if you can imagine going from left to right, individual, collective, and strategic or systems, if you get a lot of individuals doing a lot of work together that feeds into a more collective line of things, to get to accomplish what that collective wants to do, you have to start thinking in big systems like those mammoth solar arrays, or even when I ask people, I said, well, what do you think about nuclear energy? And I usually get a big backlash. And I said, wait. I'm not talking about fission energy. I'm talking about fusion energy. That's what powers the sun. And right now, China's probably 5, maybe 10 years ahead of us in the research. And there's actually some research that's taking place at the University of Rochester Laser Energetics Laboratory. Or how do you design a containment vessel that can hold that amount of incredibly intense energy, so that you can contain it and generate power off of it to be used and putting onto an electrical grid. And it's this very, very experimental, but then you take into consideration, it didn't take that long for the Wright brothers for people who actually were born around the time that the Wright brothers flew their first airplane to see a man on the moon. So.
And I'll also just in terms of community action and what's going on, there's a program called Climate Smart Communities. It's a New York State program. And there's a website out there where you can go and see if your community is involved and learn more about what's going on there. And also, one of the webinars that we'll be hosting as part of our Lake Friendly Living Awareness Month is on that topic. It will be, I think it's May 7th. I'll just encourage you to go back to the registration website, but it will feature an expert from the New York State program from Albany, and then also a local township, Owasco, that has recently been certified. So if you want to look at more community action and ideally how you could be involved in it, I encourage you to start there. It's Climate Smart Communities. So there's a webinar going on this month, and you can also go to the website and learn more at your local level. So we have another question here about regarding what heavy rains are put into lake. Klaus Martins has observed that phosphate fertilizer added to fields in a dry spring, they get washed into the lakes by August rains and prompts HABs. Do you want to comment on that, Fred?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, you know, you take a look at some of the housing development that have been up on the higher hills along the entire Finger Lakes. All of them want to have really nice manicured lawns, and they use fertilizer. And if it does rain out, it does have a problem in terms of increasing vegetation in the lakes. Whether or not people, I would contact the DEC to find out, because if anybody's monitoring that, it has to be the DEC. Because I know one of the lakes where this has been a concern. My wife's family used to have a summer cottage on Canisius Lake. And I recall that in 1972, when Hurricane Agnes went through, well, I'll tell you, there were some of the lakes that got really flushed out. And the aquatic vegetation went away for a while. Some of the fish species responded quite nicely. And there was a cleansing that took place when you had that volume of water. And yeah, I mean, there was shoreline damage, and some houses got flooded, but it did tend to remove a lot of that material from the lake. But it's a legitimate concern. But I would contact the DEC for the exact data.
Well, and again, each lake association is very involved in HABs monitoring and also trying to, reporting on what we're finding and the links to it. So I would encourage you to look at your lake association's websites under their HABs programs, and you'll learn things specific to your lake likely. And I think just as a follow-up to one of the concerns about runoff, the heavy rains in August was more, septics are a big issue, obviously, in our rural areas around the lakes. Any comments about the septic factor, Fred, in runoff?
Well, it depends on how those septic fields are going to be inundated with water. If it's going to be enough percolation from severe rain events that cause I guess we call like a leakage of the sewage coming out. But I haven't been looking at that data, other than the fact I know that it could happen. To what extent, I don't know. That would probably be something you would want to take a look at the local level, at the town. Maybe I would say looking at the town, or if it's a municipality that doesn't have a sewage treatment plant, but it's a lot of septic sewerage going on. Your town would probably have one of its environmental or facilities groups would be the place to go.
Yeah, and at the county level as well. I know Seneca County, where I'm located, has some specific activities associated with septic monitoring.
Yeah. Well, another concern gets into that, and that's where you might be able to find some additional information from your county cooperative extension services, especially as it pertains to farm, agricultural runoff.
Yep. So a comment from someone worth noting is note that local governments are quite active in planning and adaptation, which is a big part of dealing with the climate crisis. But these problems are bigger than the region. And Fred, as you were talking about systemically, even bigger than the state. So regional and watershed focused organizations are important in helping coordinate efforts. Thank you very much for that comment. And that's what we're trying to do with everything from the state programs to the local associations to leveraging wonderful experts like Fred.
I know another problem, more or less, with I guess we call it a federal response to some of these. I know that there have been instances in New York State where you get these, I guess we want to call them microclimatic conditions, where they have a flash flood that impacts a very, very small region. I know that there were times over by Fort Plain where there was a massive rain out. I think there were 2 or 3 fatalities. over towards Roscoe, up on the one of the feeder streams to the Beaverkill Creek. It widened from something like a maximum width of 10 feet to something like 40 yards with a massive rain up. And the people who had the damages in their infrastructure, their houses and the such, they were too small to be compensated for by FEMA. So they've had to come up with other strategies of changing some of the requirements for what's an area that is impacted by a disaster, and how do you make those declarations. And again, I've given several presentations about what are the roles that libraries, especially public libraries, what are the roles that they have in assisting the communities in which they serve, or the communities in which they actually reside, and the communities that they serve, and helping those communities prepare adequate disaster preparedness and planning policies and options. The greatest example in New York State is Wyndham, that during one of those hurricane storms, Wyndham was completely shut off from all of New York State when every single bridge crossing every single stream in and around Wyndham was washed out. And they were isolated for the better portion of a week before they could get temporary bridges installed to link the city of Wyndham to the rest of New York State.
So I think that's it with the questions. As Fred said, he can stay on a little longer if people want to open up and have more of a conversation. That's very welcomed. But otherwise, we just appreciate all the participants. We encourage you to learn more. This is just the beginning, a lot of great information. And also to go back to the Lake Friendly Living website and see if there is any other webinars or even live demonstrations you might want to participate in. There will be probably another 17 of them over the course of the next 4 weeks. So you're all welcome to attend. Thank you, Fred, so much. We've enjoyed
well,
this.
thank you.
A lot to think about.
Oh,
This is the beginning.
Yeah, I think that people who listen to Al Gore talk for 2 hours or more, but not me. There's a lot that I didn't cover. There's 3 major areas where he goes into great detail about water, food, and health. I actually have an hour-long program on the realities of the inconveniences of your carbon footprint. That talks about what are the impacts to agricultural and agriculture and aquaculture from the effects of climate change to them. How do they contribute to climate change? And taking a look at some of the practices for the farms of the future, which include building farm fields in buildings in major cities that could actually use some of that vacant building space that is located in almost every single major city, and employ a couple hundred people in upkeeping and keeping those farms that could be in some cases 17 stories high. It's a lot of glass.
So does that mean we can invite you back next year for that webinar, Fred?
Yeah, sure. I'm like I said,
interesting.
I'm more than happy. He does another one on the health effects, which I've done on our campus a couple of times for taking a look at that. And I know that I think it was last year there was a pledge by 250 or so medical journals that ran editorials in support of rigorously attacking the climate crisis, because of the health effects. And when you look at it worldwide, it's catastrophic in terms of insect-borne diseases, water potability. So.
Well, we also thank you for all your efforts, what you've done over the many decades in terms of your commitment to sustainability. So you've made a big change and difference. So we appreciate all your work in that respect.
I know somebody back when I was working at the Center for Environmental Information up in Rochester from 80 to 80. Where was I when I was there? 82 to 90. Somebody, I actually think I have a really good idea who sent it to me. Somebody sent me a cartoon of a really under the influence, sort of like caricature of an Andy Garcia kind of a character. And the caption just read, "Acid Rain, REIGN." I probably have it somewhere in a folder here under under funny things happened on the way to the toxic dump site, which is the name of an article that Joyce Shaw down in Mississippi and I are going to be writing this summer. We got some really good stuff to talk about. I mean, the stuff is this. You got to take. Sometimes you got to interject humor into this stuff, or you'll be depressed.
Well, if it helps get people to listen, that's important too.
Well, that's the big thing is right now is getting people educated. Now, I know that there is something like 23 states right now that are coming up with severe restrictions on teaching climate change in our public and private school, or public schools mostly, because very few states can actually regulate what they teach in a private school. But and I think there's 3 states where still, and North Carolina is one of them, where no official state or state funded or state sponsored program can use the phrase climate change. They're prohibited from doing it. So you know.
Well, we don't want to end on doom and gloom, so we'll end on.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying honestly, what you shared with us tonight was so helpful, and I hope it gives us all something to think about, and more importantly, to act on as well. So look up your local lake associations, learn more through our webinar series, and we just all appreciate the participants tonight. So
Yeah,
thank
and
you.
again, I strongly urge people to contact your local government agencies and councils and boards and your elected officials and say, look, at our area is experiencing the side effects and the direct effects of changes in our climate, and it's not going to get better. I mean, it's the best thing that you can do is not only to educate yourself, but to educate, people who make rules and regulations. So those sites that are offering some education things, and if there are any teachers or educators that were here involved, and you might actually want to put this out on your list, I'll send you the information, but the New York State Outdoor Education Association just opened up a call for presentations and posters for its annual meeting, which is going to be at the Sharp Reservation near Fishkill, New York. And you drive by some really, really good trout fishing. So anyway, have fun.
Thank you, Fred. We'll end this now. And again, thank you to all who attended.
Okay, yep. Bye-bye.
Great,
And
wonderful night.
And thank all of you and Caitlin and Maura for the technical help here. That worked out quite well, I thought.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Fred.
Yeah. Good night. I'm signing out.